So when the state utilities came and said, hey, we want you to pass this bill, it just didn't sit right in my gut. And AFP was a huge proponent in the Capitol too. They were going around saying, just look at this from a common sense standpoint. Does it make sense to allow a monopoly? And so we fought that bill, and because we want those companies to be able to bid. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to always choose the cheapest company. That it doesn't say that, but we want that competition, like you said, because it's healthy. And the state of Wisconsin, people outside of the state don't know this, but we have extremely high utility costs. And my company's a manufacturing company. My utility bills are crazy high compared to other states. So the other thing the utilities were saying was, oh, we do such a great job for you. And I'm like, you guys do a horrible job.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential. And here's your host, Jeff Crank.
Hey, thanks for joining us for another episode of American Potential. Most Americans understand the value of competition when it comes to saving money. If you have a new roof or improvements made to your home, you usually want to get a few different quotes so you can figure out which will be the best for your budget. Competition encourages lower prices and better deals, which is why it's concerning when states eliminate competition. In certain industries like utilities, states like Texas and Minnesota give utility companies the right of first refusal, or ROFR, on certain projects, allowing them to bypass competitive bidding. Now, while some argue that this ensures reliability, it also raises questions about whether taxpayers are losing out on better, lower-cost options. One state tried to pass ROFR this past session in the state of Wisconsin, but was stopped by the president of the Senate and his colleagues. I want to welcome Wisconsin State Senator Chris Kapenga to the show. Senator, thanks for being with us.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Jeff. Glad to be here.
Okay, so first of all, I understand Monica tells me you were able to get a call from President Trump, so I need to hear about the call you got from President Trump.
Yeah, that's a pretty crazy story. It was he released some press release, and my name was in it, and he misspoke. He must have gotten some bad information. So he said, he called me out on something that was totally false. And so I'm sitting at the airport. It's like 5:30 in the morning, and I have my Trump socks on. I've got my Trump mask because this was back during COVID. I mean, yeah. I love what President Trump does. I'm a big fan of his just because he's a business guy. So I'm sitting there. I'm like, I'm just going to write him a letter because I'm frustrated. So I wrote him this letter, and somehow the New York Times got their hands on it and published it. And it really just walked through and it said, hey, Mr. President, you did this to me. One of my frustrations with you is, or with the media, is they do this to you all the time. And it drives me crazy because I know it's not true about you. So I said, hey, you owe me an apology and maybe a round of golf at Mar-a-Lago. And I just kind of, off the cuff because I had nothing else to do. And I told him in the letter, I got my Trump socks on and my mask sitting here. I'm a big fan of yours. And I get a call probably about 3 days later from someone, and they're like, this is the White House calling. I'm like, yeah, right, whatever. Okay, this is probably a prank, but I'll take it because they said White House. Yeah. And they said the president would like to talk to you tomorrow night at 8 p.m. and just call you about this. I'm like, okay, sounds great. I will be available. So I'm sitting there at 8 p.m., turns into 9 p.m., 10 p.m., 11 p.m., I'm falling asleep, 11:30, and the phone rings, and it's the president. And we had a conversation, and he's like, sorry I'm late, Chris. I was down at the border. What a mess. It's just a mess down there right now. We're trying to fix it. And so just a really, I'm just a state senator. And when the president calls, it says something about President Trump, I think, as a person, that he really does care about people. So that was a cool story.
Yeah. Well, no, that is great. That is great. I'll share a little bit here. I got a call from him a few weeks back, and was surprised. The thing that surprised me the most, and I'll bet you kind of felt this way too, when I was talking to him, his voice is so familiar, and there's so many people who maybe imitate him that I almost, like, in the back of my mind, I was kind of like, man, is somebody pranking me?
Totally.
I just kind of felt like that. It wasn't, but that just, it was in the back of my mind. Is somebody doing this to me? Because he's talking to me, and he's saying my name, asking about my family and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
I'm thinking, man, this could all be a jab at me, but it wasn't. So
it just shows he's a very personal guy, and he gave me a cell phone. He's like, call me anytime you ever have anything. And I'm like, okay, so I've got President Trump in my cell phone. So I hope nobody steals my cell phone.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Well, listen, let's talk about the issue here. Before we talk about what happened with right of first refusal, share a little bit about your background and your family's farm.
Yeah, so I grew up on a farm. We had hogs, cattle, cash crop. That was my upbringing. And pretty much through the end of high school. And then obviously when I went to college, I wasn't working on the farm anymore. But yeah, grew up on the farm, absolutely loved it. In state government, there's so many times when I look at how bureaucracies run, and even when it comes to like the prison system, I'm like, oh my goodness, the lessons from the farm could be so applied here. And just how to just, when you grow up on a farm, most people who grow up on a farm know you don't have a lot of money. So you really have to figure out everything on your own, how to do everything. And being a jack of all trades, it can really be a benefit, but it also, when your friends find out from your Bible study group at church, you're constantly getting calls saying, hey, my plumbing is broken. Can you come and fix it? So the farm upbringing kind of flows into all parts of my life right now, but just the practical, just having to think on your feet, having to figure things out really plays well when you look at how government is run, and you realize how much is broken and how it just doesn't run the way it should.
Yeah, no question about that. You mentioned businesses. Let's talk about some of the businesses you've created.
Sure. So interesting. My grandfather, when I was 12 years old, we were talking about business, and I just said, Grandpa, I really like business. I don't know why. He did some business stuff. My dad was on the farm, and he's like, Chris, listen, if you're going to do business, you have to understand numbers. So when I was a sophomore, junior in high school, I actually took advanced accounting on my own. I'm like, I'm going to do accounting because I need to understand numbers. Grandpa told me to. So I took that all the way through college, got my CPA license. I was in public accounting for 6 or 7 years, went to GE Medical Systems for a couple of years, and then I bought my first company at 29, and kind of a cool product. It was a motorsports dealership. So, bought it. It was very small, kind of run down, and we took it, and God just blessed the business. We were able to turn it around, and we were selling. I sold a crate of ATVs to Hungary right before I sold the business. So just a really cool story of, again, taking the practical things from the farm into business. After that, I owned an IT company and sold that about 5 years ago. Right now, I own my wife and I bought a manufacturing company about 2 years ago. So we own a manufacturing firm. I actually flew over from the plant floor because somebody was sick today. I was cutting metal pieces. I had chips flying all over my hair. I'm like, oh, great, Jeff. I'm going to show up and Jeff's going to say, you got something shiny on your face, Chris.
I don't see it. So okay. I think you're good. You're good. So tell us about you making the decision to run for office. Like, what made you decide to run for office? I'm always interested in that, why anybody does decide to run for office. And did you ever think you would run for office?
No, politics was the furthest thing from my mind. But I think I know it was very clear to us that we just started getting this sense inside. My wife and I, we both thought about it. It was when, if you remember, when Barack Obama and John McCain were running for the presidency. And just personally, we looked at it and we're like, is this the best we can come up with in the country? And John McCain, I respect his service, but I do not respect a lot of the positions. And I'm a strong conservative. I'm a constitutionalist. And I just was like, is this the best we can come up with in the entire country? And it made me and my wife and I really realize, like if the good guys don't step up, the bad guys will. And that's an old saying that applies anywhere, but especially in politics, because there's this draw to power. And I think that, that corrupts a lot of people. So we just had this calling kind of like come in our minds, and neither of us talked to each other about it because we're like, you're crazy. We've never thought about politics. And then one night we were just talking about it, and we both kind of said we sensed a calling possibly to this. And we talked to some friends, and then we had this whole, it's too long to talk about in the podcast, but these crazy things happen. Like our house sold for above asking price in a market that was just tanked back in 2009. The realtor's like, you guys are crazy. There's no way you're going to get this much for your house, but we'll put it up for a week. We'll try it, whatever. And it sold to the first person that walked through at asking price. And it's just like all these things that just fell into place. We're like, okay, we are clearly being called to step into a realm that we call a mission field because it's so broken. And I think that a lot of people in business get so busy doing business that it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I just felt this sense to public service, and I never ended up going into the military. I was really close to signing up at 17, and I just kind of look at it as God called us to this, and it's a place to serve my country in a unique way, and we felt like this is where it just fit best. So that's, to make a long story short, that's kind of how I got involved in politics. But it was really a frustration and a scare, really, with the things I was hearing from Barack Obama and how he was going to fundamentally change America. I'm like, That's not what we want. We love America. We love, a poor farm kid whose parents were on welfare for a stint because we were so poor, was able to work hard enough to be able to build a couple of small companies. And it's the American dream that he wants to change, or he wanted to change. And I would argue he has definitely set the course for changing the fabric of America for a terrible course.
Yeah. Well, and that's, you talked about if good people don't step up, bad people do. And I think, as you were saying that, there's two examples of that. The first is people who run for office, right? Because power does attract people who maybe don't have the best intentions. So I think it's true in politics. And when you see, candidates making decisions to run, it is always great to have good people step up and run for the right reasons, right? To preserve the Constitution, to preserve the republic as we have it. Because there are people who step up who do want to fundamentally change that. But I also think when you were saying that, I also think about world affairs. You think about that. If America isn't there to lead, and America being a country that supports human rights, that supports, through our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, supports liberty and freedom. If we don't step up, there are bad actors in the world who will step up and fill that void. And so you're exactly right when you say that, and you stepped up for the exact right reasons.
Yeah. Well, you see leadership matters. And you look at the difference between President Trump and President Biden, and just the complete collapse of leadership, the collapse of that impact. It was a ripple effect throughout the world right now, which is why we're in chaos. And that's why I'm encouraged by what we're seeing nationally with election stuff. But I really hope people kind of open their eyes, don't necessarily believe all they're seeing in the media about, basically the straight out lies that are being told. But we've got to get that leadership back in the presidency for the world. So you're right on. It's a big deal. And I say it's the most important election ever. This one, it is absolutely, I am so fearful based on stuff I'm seeing coming out of Washington, even at the state level, to the states, of what would happen if a Kamala Harris presidency took place. It is a scary, scary thing.
All right, let's talk about right of first refusal. Let's start by explaining what right of first refusal is.
So I'm going to keep it real simple because it gets a little complex. But as you said in your introduction, it was a great introduction because right of first refusal. So the state utilities, they have transmission lines that go from Iowa to Wisconsin, from Illinois to Wisconsin, and somebody's got to build those transmission lines and that transmission of electricity. So between states. So what they wanted was a bill that would essentially say that we, as the state utility, we want to be the only ones that are able to control, and we want to build these transmission lines. And what the federal government is saying is, hey, if we've got somebody who's building a line up through Illinois, it would probably make sense for that company because they've got all the people. Think about all the people, all the equipment, the know-how, because they just built the transmission line up to the state line. Why don't we make sure that we allow those companies to bid building the rest of the transmission line into the state of Wisconsin? And the utilities here are essentially a monopoly, and they were like, whoa, wait a minute. No, we kind of like being able to control everything. And so we want a bill, legislature, can you please pass a bill that would say, federal government, you can't tell us to do that. And they kind of guised it. They're very smart. They're like, hey, we don't want the federal government telling us what to do. And I'm like, no, I totally agree with that. States' rights. However, as a business guy, and as you said, just as a family, if you're putting a roof on, bidding and competition gives you lower prices usually, and it gives you a higher quality of product because people are like, well, I want them to choose me again on the next project, so I'm going to do really well. I'm going to do it for as cheap as I can. And so my job is to look out for the taxpayers. So when the state utilities came and said, hey, we want you to pass this bill, it just didn't sit right in my gut. And AFP was a huge proponent in the Capitol too. They were going around saying, just look at this from a common sense standpoint. Does it make sense to allow a monopoly? Right. And so we fought that bill, and because we want those companies to be able to bid. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to always choose the cheapest company. That it doesn't say that, but we want that competition, like you said, because it's healthy. And the state of Wisconsin, people outside of the state don't know this, but we have extremely high utility costs. And my company's a manufacturing company. My utility bills are crazy high compared to other states. So the other thing the utilities were saying was, oh, we do such a great job for you. And I'm like, you guys do a horrible job. So the last people I'm going to trust are the ones who are already doing a horrible job when they say, just trust us, we'll do a great job for you. I'm like, you're already failing at it because we got terrible utility costs here. So that's really the gist of what they were trying to get through that me and some other colleagues stopped.
Yeah. Well, and let me just take a quick note to talk to regular viewers and listeners to this podcast. This is another example of competition. We talked about it with regard to education savings accounts and education, and how that's really the only solution to improve education is to infuse competition into what is a monopoly right now. And the same thing is true with veterans healthcare. We've talked about it in the VA healthcare system and how the Veterans Administration wants to continue to force veterans to get their health care from the VA. They don't want veterans to be able to go outside of that system and get health care because they like having the built-in customers, right? And they don't want competition. And the only way to improve veterans health care and lower costs for the government is, frankly, to allow that kind of competition. And this is no different. So let me just ask you that, Senator, with your background in business. I mean, this seems obvious to me.
It does.
But let's explain it to the listeners and the viewers. Why does right of first refusal not work for taxpayers?
Well, it's because we found this out after we killed the bill. But what the utilities were doing is they were actually having conversations with the union-run companies, and they were going to have an exclusivity agreement that only would allow union contractors to work on the projects from within the state. Right. So just take that on its face and be like, that is corrupt. And I'm not saying union companies are bad, they can do good work too. But for crying out loud, anybody who looks at that says, well, why wouldn't you allow all the companies within the state? So now they're taking it where they control everything. And now they're going to narrow it down to a subsegment and funnel all these dollars through union companies who, by the way, a lot of these union companies fund our opponents on the other side. So it's just one more thing that it just didn't make sense.
So let me just ask you, did you get then unions that were supporting this piece of legislation on right of first refusal because they had that sort of back agreement? Did you have any of that?
Well, they were smart enough not to step into the fray on this because they didn't want people to start digging into stuff. So, so you didn't really see a lot of that because my understanding was that this was a backroom discussion on purpose, because if the Republican caucus would have known about that, there probably would have been more people even who fought this and were like, it just doesn't make sense.
Right.
So I think in government, kind of to your previous point, I call it the yellow page test. Everything in government, if you can flip to the yellow pages, which your younger audience has no clue what we're talking about right now.
No, they don't know what is a yellow page.
Maybe it's just, what do we call it? Maybe a Google search test.
That's right.
Where if there's a private company that does something, in everything, we should allow those companies to look at doing it instead of having government monopolize it, because I can tell you, the stuff we see, Jeff, in government, the inefficiency, it's time after time after time after time where you're like, well, why are you doing this? And they're like, well, because that's how we do it. And it makes no sense. And it just kills the taxpayers. Yeah.
Well, and just to drive the point home, I mean, you're talking about the issue of only allowing union companies to bid. Right there, you're raising rates, and who pays for that? It's taxpayers, right? Yep. Taxpayers are ultimately going to do that. True competition would allow anyone to do it. And I have no problem with the union company being able to win such a contract. They just need to do it not at the expense of the taxpayers. They ought to do it for the cheapest or for the best price for the best product.
Yep. So, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So now this wasn't the first time that the bill had been voted on. How many times had it been up for a vote before?
Well, last session it came up. It never even got to the floor, just because internally with the caucus, which is just the Republicans, there were not the votes to even get it there. So it went into committee.
Before we go further, let's talk about the makeup of your legislature too, so people understand who controls the chambers.
So the Republicans control both chambers, the House and the Senate.
Gotcha. Okay, sorry about that. You bet.
That's okay. And the governorship right now is a Democrat. So we've got this kind of weird mix of legislation that's flowing through even to us. We're seeing a lot of things that when we had Governor Walker, my goodness, that was a dream. We just loved it because it was like red meat, great for people, great for people, great for people. And now, when you have kind of a mixed government, you're getting a lot of things slipped in where it just doesn't pass the sniff test like this. I mean, if a Governor Walker or a Republican governor were in place, I highly doubt this would have even come up. Mm-hmm. Right. So we have to get a Republican governor back in place in the state of Wisconsin. That's important.
So how many times had it been voted on before?
Well, it had gone through committee process before last session, but they don't bring it to the floor unless they know they've got close to the votes. And then this was the second time, and that's very normal for legislation. I passed the balanced budget amendment. We sent our application into Congress. I think it was 3 or 4 sessions ago. That took me 4 sessions to get through. So you just start it, and then sometimes you just keep working to get more and more votes. So they're doing the same thing with this. They did it 2 sessions ago. They did it this session, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw it come back up next session, where they try to push it through again. But now that the union discussion is now a public thing, I think it's going to make it a lot harder for them.
Yeah. So how were you able? I mean, in your mind, how were you able to stop right of first refusal this session?
Well, there were a couple of things. First, it was just that I had some very strong colleagues who stood up and said, hey, this is not right. And they really worked just different members so that we never got to a point where there were enough members in the Republican caucus to get this to the floor. They were getting close. And as the president of the Senate, I actually did a procedural move on the floor to disallow it from being pulled off the message. And really, it's just, I made it so that they had to have the votes in the Republican caucus to make sure they brought it to the floor, and they couldn't play some funny tricks with the rules of the Senate. And that was really just, for me, I want to make sure I protect the integrity of the Senate. And that's not even a Republican Democrat thing. It's just, I feel there's certain ways that the Senate should run. I'm the constitutional officer. I'm not the political officer. Mm-hmm. So there are times when I step up and I say, this is about the integrity of the Senate, and we are not going to do things below board. Everything needs to be above board. So I did a procedural move essentially to make sure that they couldn't kind of go around the normal process that a bill has to go through. So that was one thing that I did that was pretty unusual to do, but I felt strongly about it, and you do what's right, even if it's not easy.
Right. Well, what's the likelihood that right of first refusal comes back next session?
I think it's fairly likely. I haven't heard anything. We're not in session right now. So we ended session. We're in the campaign cycle, and then we'll start back up 1st of January. And that's when you'll see fairly soon. You'll know in the first couple of weeks of January if they're going to try to bring this back and run it through the legislature again. They have the Democrat governor for another 2 years, and he's already signed off on it, basically saying, I'll sign whatever you want. So they know they have the governor on board. So now they just have to really work the Senate, because even the Assembly or the House, they got the votes to put it through. So we really were the stopping force in the legislature.
That's great. Are you confident? It seems like you sound like you are confident that you're making progress, though, in stopping this. Do you think your vote tally is going to get stronger or weaker over the? I guess it depends on the makeup of the caucus, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, we've got a couple of seats that may change. That will make a difference. I think, again, back to this kind of backroom deal, that's not going to sit right with more and more people. So I'm hoping that along with just, and I'm not putting other people down, but in my mind, common sense just prevails in the end. And we're like, listen, this just doesn't make sense. We're already one of the highest states in the nation for our utilities. Let's not go down the road of buying the guise of, well, we don't want the federal government to tell us what to do. And going against just the logic of competition and what's best for ratepayers or citizens.
Right. Yeah. And have you got other groups that are coming in? I know you mentioned Americans for Prosperity.
Yeah.
Who I view as the lobbyist for the taxpayer. Right. I mean, that's how I've always viewed AFP's role as, everybody up in any legislative body tends to have a lot of lobbyists available, but the ones who don't are the taxpayer oftentimes. And Americans for Prosperity plays that role many times. So they were there, but have you got other groups that are kind of coming on board as well?
Yeah, for sure. So there's, like I said, I'm in the manufacturing world, but there were a group of larger manufacturers. We're a small business, but the larger manufacturers who have super high utility costs, they formed a group and they were fighting it publicly. The non-union builders were fighting it as well, saying, hey, let's allow competition. Competition is the heart of what we do as America. So we had other groups, a lot of business related groups saying, doesn't pass the sniff test. Let's not push this through. So I think that helped a lot too. I got a letter from one of the large companies from the CEO just saying, hey, thanks for fighting the fight on this and keep fighting it, because it would have a significant negative impact on us, which as a Wisconsin run company, that puts us at disadvantages to companies if they're based in, Texas or Iowa or whatever, where they're able to provide lower cost on their utilities. All of a sudden, if we have our costs increase, that goes into our product pricing and how we bid projects. and that could be negative for in-state companies. So it was good to see these businesses step up and really fight it and talk about it. I'm sure they talked about it with their employees, saying, hey, if this goes through and our utility costs go up so much, it could mean your job, because those jobs, it may flow elsewhere. It could be in the U.S. It could be outside of the U.S.
Right.
That's what you're seeing. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, you would think that any business organization, whether it's manufacturers or, a chamber of commerce or whatever, ought to be on board on this. And you've got to hold folks accountable. I mean, it's just a matter of competition. And obviously competition is going to make things better for consumers, including businesses who have to do this. And at a time when we see inflation going through the roof, I mean, these are the kinds of decisions that can help tamp down inflation if you get a better utility rate because of good decisions by government in this case, as opposed to bad decisions. So this is really an important moment. So, all right.
And it's all the little things that you see. Sometimes people are like, well, it's a small thing, just let it go. But it's a million small things in government that make us have billion-dollar budgets and that cost taxpayers a lot of money. So you got to fight the little fights, because that's what adds up to the big stuff.
Yeah. And I guess the last question I'd have is, I mean, you're fighting this battle in Wisconsin, but how many other states are you aware of where this is probably going on and nobody's fighting the battle?
I'm sure there are other states that are fighting. I know some states have already gone through it. I was told one of the states, and I can't remember which one it was, it might have been Iowa, put it through and now they're regretting it. So yeah, the utilities in each state, they kind of see what other states are doing. I'm sure other states are trying to push it through right now. But hopefully we can be one that stops it and we don't go down that road.
Yeah. Well, we got to figure out what we call the yellow pages today. Did we figure that out, Senator? We and I don't know what it is. It is hard to explain that, but I've always used that as an example too. Like if you can look in the yellow pages and find a business that does it, government shouldn't be doing it as a service. So yeah, maybe it's just a Google search now. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, Senator, thanks for your great work on this issue and many other things. You're a great policy champion. We appreciate you joining us.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for having me on, Jeff.
You bet. All right. Well, listen, this is another great example of just a policy issue where government makes a bad decision and it impacts the people of Wisconsin or the people of any state where a bill like this would go through. These are the bad decisions that government makes that have a profound impact on everyday Americans. And we see it all the time, and we highlight it on this show all the time. So thank goodness we have great policy champions like the senator out there fighting these issues for us. So listen, liberty and freedom, easily taken for granted. Don't take liberty and freedom for granted. Go out there and defend them. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate you being with us.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.